Good evening, and welcome. Tonight, the story is the complete story of Krishna, the dark blue child of Gokul, and everything that came after him. The night he was carried across a river in the rain, the years among the cattle and the long grass, the flute in the night forest, the city built upon the sea, and the last quiet hour in a grove at the end of a life. There is nothing to follow closely. The story will carry itself, and it will still be here if you drift away from it, and it will not mind. If you wake in the middle of the night, you may begin again wherever you like, because every part of this story has been told on its own for a very long time, and none of the parts are strangers to each other. If these stories help you rest, subscribing tells me to make more of them. As one telling has it then, in the time before this time, the earth grew heavy. Not heavy the way a stone is heavy, and not heavy the way a full river is heavy, but heavy the way a house becomes heavy when the people inside it have stopped being kind to one another. The old tellers describe it as a weather rather than as a war. Very slow, soft, low, and even, with unhurried pauses at the end of every sentence. Keep the energy calm and soothing throughout. Read only the provided text. Do not add or improvise any extra words. They say that the seasons kept their appointments, and the rains came when the rains were expected, and the grain stood up in the fields as grain does. And yet something had gone wrong in the way that people held their power, so that the strong had grown restless with their strength, and had begun to use it for no reason at all, simply because it was there, and because nobody had told them not to. And the earth, who is patient, and who has carried a great deal in her time, began at last to feel the weight of it in her shoulders, the way a woman carrying water feels the last mile of the road. And so, the story tells us, the earth went to those who might listen, and she said, in whatever way the earth says things, that she was tired. We will come back to what was done about it. First, there is a city. The city was called Mathura, which stood on the western bank of the Yamuna, the dark, slow river that has always gone through the middle of this story, and has always been in no hurry. Mathura was a good city in the ordinary way of good cities. It had a river gate where the steps went down into the water, and were worn smooth in the middle by generations of feet. It had lamps that were lit at dusk along the parapet, and the lamps doubled themselves in the river, so that anyone standing on the far bank in the evening would see two cities, one of them steady, and one of them moving. It had cattle in the lanes at the end of the day, and it had grain merchants who cheated a little and were forgiven. And it had an old wall with grass growing out of the top of it, that nobody ever quite got around to pulling out. In this city there lived a woman named Devaki, who would in time become the mother who bore him in a locked room, though on the day we are speaking of, she was only a young woman of a good family, with her whole life folded up ahead of her, unopened. And there was a man named Vasudeva, his father, who would one day carry a child across a river in the rain, though on that day he was only a bridegroom, and rather a nervous one, as bridegrooms are. They were married in the ordinary way, with the drums and the smoke and the relatives, and the marriage was a happy one from the beginning, which is worth saying because so much of what comes afterward is difficult, and it is good to know that it began well. When the ceremony was finished, the family did what families did, and put the two of them in a chariot to be driven through the streets of the city, so that everyone could see them and be pleased. And Devaki had a cousin, and the cousin's name was Kamsa, and he took the reins of that chariot himself. Here we must be careful, because the story is about to become a story with a frightened man in it, and it is easy to make a frightened man into a monster. And the older tellers do not entirely do that. Kamsa was the king of Mathura, who could not sleep. He was young. He was strong in the way that men who have never been refused anything are strong. He was fond of his cousin in the careless way that people are fond of cousins. And on that evening he was in a good humor, standing up in the chariot with the reins in his hands, driving his cousin and her new husband slowly through a city full of people who were throwing flowers at them. And then, the story tells us, there came a voice out of a clear sky. It is important that the sky was clear. Very slow, soft, low, and even, with unhurried pauses at the end of every sentence. Keep the energy calm and soothing throughout. Read only the provided text. Do not add or improvise any extra words. There was no cloud for it to have come from, no thunder to explain it away afterward, nothing that could be described the next morning as probably a cart on the bridge. There was only the evening, and the flowers coming down, and the noise of a pleased city, and then a voice that spoke calmly and briefly, and was heard, as far as anyone could tell, by one man only. And what the voice said was this, that the 8th child of the woman standing behind him in the chariot would be the end of him. Now a man can be told a thing like that and put it away. Many men have. The trouble was that Kamsa believed it at once and completely. The way one believes a thing one has always half suspected. And the belief went into him and did not come out again. He stopped the chariot in the middle of the street. The flowers went on falling for a moment, because a crowd takes a little while to notice that something has changed. and then they stopped too. What he did in the next hour is told differently in different places, and none of the tellings are gentle, and we will not linger on them. It is enough to say that Vasudeva spoke to him for a long time in the road, quietly, the way you speak to a horse that has been startled, and that by the end of it a bargain had been struck. The marriage would stand, and the couple would live, and in return they would live inside the walls of the king's house, and every child born to them would be brought to the king. And so Devaki and Vasudeva went into a room in Mathura, and the door of that room was closed, and it stayed closed for years. The story says that the years there were hard, and they were, and the tellers do not pretend otherwise. But it also says, if you listen, that they were not only hard. There was a lamp in that room, and it was refilled by somebody. There was food, and somebody cooked it. There were guards outside the door who had been children in that city once, and who had mothers of their own. And some of them were cruel, and some of them were merely obedient. And one or two of them, over the long seasons, became something almost like It is enough to say that Vasudeva spoke to him for a long time in the road, quietly, the way you speak to a horse that has been startled, and that by the end of it a bargain had been struck. The marriage would stand, and the couple would live, and in return they would live inside the walls of the king's house, and every child born to them would be brought to the king. And so Devaki and Vasudeva went into a room in Mathura, and the door of that room was closed, and it stayed closed for years. The story says that the years there were hard, and they were, and the tellers do not pretend otherwise. But it also says, if you listen, that they were not only hard. There was a lamp in that room, and it was refilled by somebody. There was food, and somebody cooked it. There were guards outside the door who had been children in that city once, and who had mothers of their own. And some of them were cruel, and some of them were merely obedient. And one or two of them, over the long seasons, became something almost like company. Kindness gets into locked rooms the way water gets into a boat, slowly and through small openings, and by the end there was a surprising amount of it in there. And there was a window. It was a narrow window with 3 bars in it, set high in the wall. And through it, if you stood where the floor was worn, you could see one particular square of the sky. Devaki knew that square of sky better than she had ever known anything. She knew which stars crossed it, and in what order, and at what time of the year. She knew the exact gray that came into it before the monsoon, and the way the swifts went across it at evening, 20 of them, and then none, and the way it turned the color of the inside of a shell about an hour before dawn. There were 6 children born in that room, and 6 children carried out of it, and the story tells us this quickly, and then goes quiet for a moment, as it should. Then there was a 7th, and the 7th was taken elsewhere by means the story explains in its own way, and grew up in another house entirely, and became his elder brother, fair as the moon, strong as the plough, whose name was Balarama, and who will walk into this story later on with dust on his feet. And then Devaki was expecting again, and it was the 8th time, and everyone in the city, in the way of cities, somehow knew it. Very slow, soft, low, and even, with unhurried pauses at the end of every sentence. The king doubled the guard on the door. Then he doubled it again. He had the chains checked and the hinges checked, and he went up onto his own roof at night and stood there, looking at nothing, because a man who has spent years being afraid of a child has by then forgotten how to do anything else with his evenings. And below the wall of the prison, 100 steps away, and out of sight of the barred window, the Yamuna went on past the city, as it had always gone past the city, dark and slow, and entirely unhurried, carrying the reflected lamps a little way downstream, and then letting them go. You will remember the locked room in Mathura, and the narrow window with 3 bars in it, and the square of sky that Devaki, the mother who bore him in a locked room, had come to know better than she had ever known anything. It was the season of rain, and it was near the middle of the night, and it was very dark. The tellers agree that the weather came first. There had been a heaviness over the city all evening, the kind that makes dogs restless and makes people say to one another that it will break by morning. And then, a little before midnight, it broke. The rain came down on Mathura the way rain comes down at the height of the season, straight and thick and steady, so that the lanes turned to running water, and the lamps along the parapet went out one after another. And the whole city, guards and merchants and grandmothers and thieves, did what everyone does in such rain, which is to go inside and lie down and listen to it and stop being awake. And in that room, at the middle of that night, a child was born. The old accounts spend a good deal of language on how the room looked afterward, and they are not describing a fire or a burning. They are describing the opposite of noise. Very slow, soft, low, and even, with unhurried pauses at the end of every sentence. Keep the energy calm and soothing throughout. Read only the provided text. Do not add or improvise any extra words. They say that a light came into the cell, and that it was a quiet light, low and even and warm, of the kind that a lamp gives after the flame has settled, except that there was more of it, and it had no source. They say it did not wake the guards. They say the rain went on. They say that for a while the two people in that room simply looked at what had arrived, as parents do, and did not think anything useful at all. The child was dark, the deep blue dark of the sky in the hour before it becomes properly black. And that color is the whole of his name. For Krishna is simply what that country calls that darkness. And it is the name he was given, and the name he kept. He was small, and he was, by all accounts, entirely calm. Then, the story tells us, 3 things happened, one after another, without any drama attached to them. The chains that held Vasudeva, his father, who would carry a child across a river in the rain, loosened and fell away from his wrists. They did not shatter. Nobody struck them. They simply came apart, the way a knot comes apart when you have been pulling at the wrong end of it for years, and then, without meaning to, pull the right one. The door of the room, which was barred from the outside, swung inward and stood open. And the guards along the passage, who were sitting up against the wall with their spears across their knees, went to sleep sitting up, and stayed that way. Vasudeva stood in the doorway for a while. It is worth imagining him honestly. He was not a hero out of the older kind of story. He was a man of middle years who had been in one room for a very long time, and his wrists hurt where the iron had been, and he was being asked by nothing that had spoken to him and nothing he could argue with, to walk out of that door into the rain with a newborn child. Devaki did not ask him to stay. This is the part of the night that the tellers handle most carefully, and they handle it by saying almost nothing. She had held 6 children in that room and had kept none of them. She looked at the 7th she would not keep, and she gave him up while he was still warm from her, and she told her husband to go quickly. So he took a shallow basket and lined it and put the child in it and lifted it onto his head in the way that anyone carries a load in that country. And he walked out through the open door and down the passage past the sleeping men and out into the rain. The city let him go. It was not watching. Every shutter was closed, and every lane was a stream. And a man walking with a basket on his head at the worst hour of the worst rain of the year is the most ordinary sight in the world, and the least likely to exist. He came down the steps of the river gate, the ones worn smooth in the middle by generations of feet. And there was the Yamuna, the dark, slow river. And it was not slow that night. It was up over the lower steps, and it was moving hard, and it was the color of the sky, which is to say, no color at all. And it was making the long, unbroken sound that a river in flood makes, which is a sound with no edges in it. There was no boat. There would not have been a boatman, even if there had been a boat. And so the story arrives at the moment it is named for. And it is a strange moment, because nothing is defeated in it. Very slow, soft, low, and even, with unhurried pauses at the end of every sentence. Keep the energy calm and soothing throughout. Read only the provided text. Do not add or improvise any extra words. The tellers do not say that Vasudeva fought the river, or commanded it, or bargained with it. They say that he walked down to the edge of it, holding the basket steady with one hand, and that the river drew back. It drew back the way water draws back from a hand set on the surface of a full bowl. It parted and stood aside and left a path of wet ground between two walls of moving darkness, and it held there patiently, the way a person holds a door for someone whose arms are full. He walked across. The rain fell on him all the way. The child in the basket above his head slept, or did not sleep, according to which telling you have, though every telling agrees that he made no sound at all. On the far bank was Gokul, the cowherd village by the river, and it was asleep, and it smelled of wet cattle and wet thatch, and the smoke of fires that had been damped down for the night. There were no walls and no gate, and nobody keeping watch, because there was nothing there worth taking except cows, and everybody in that country loved cows too much to steal them from people who slept beside them. In the largest house, which was not large, there lay Yashoda, the mother who raised him, of the cowherd village, and she had given birth that same night. And she was as deeply asleep as a woman is at the end of such a day. Beside her lay her newborn daughter. The story does not linger here. Vasudeva went in out of the rain. He set down the basket. He lifted the sleeping girl and put the boy in her place, and put the girl into the basket, and covered her, and went out again. Nobody woke. That is the whole of it. A mother turned over in her sleep, in a village with no walls, and did not know that her son had been exchanged for another woman's son, and would not know it, in some tellings, for the rest of her life. He crossed back. The river let him, and then closed behind him. And by the time he had come up the worn steps, it was as though it had never opened at all. He went in through the door of the prison. He lay the basket down in the room, And Devaki looked into it, and saw a daughter who was not hers, and understood, and said nothing. The chains came back onto his wrists. The door swung shut, and the bar dropped into place on the outside. Along the passage, the guards woke up with the stiff necks of men who have slept sitting against a wall and did not know they had. And then, at last, in the smallest hours, the child in the basket began to cry, as newborns do. And the crying went down the passage, and up the stairs, and through the king's house, and reached the one man in Mathura who had not been able to sleep for years. What happened next is told quickly, and told with the ending given first, and we will do the same. The king came down. He took the child from the room, and the child was not harmed, and was not his to harm, and was gone out of his hands before he had understood what he was holding. And there was a voice in the room again, and this time everyone heard it. It said, more or less, that he had been looking in the wrong place, and that the one he was afraid of had already been born, and was already somewhere else, and was at that moment several miles away across a river, asleep beside a woman who thought he was hers. And then it was quiet, and it was still raining, and the king of Mathura was left standing in an empty room at 4 a.m. with nothing to fight. The tellers are not kind to him after this, but they do pause just here, and they let you see him for a moment as he was, a young man in a cold room, holding nothing, having spent every year of his adult life on a prophecy, and having just been told, courteously, that all of it had been for nothing. Then the rain began to thin, as rain does toward morning, and the sound of it grew softer and less certain, and away to the east the sky over the river turned the color of the inside of a shell. In 2 houses on 2 banks of one river, 2 mothers slept. One of them had lost a child and knew it. One of them had gained a child and did not, and the child was Krishna, and he was some 4 hours old, and he slept as newborns sleep, with his hands closed, and the water between them ran on southward in the last of the dark, carrying nothing, telling nobody, entirely unhurried. You will remember the child carried across a river in the rain, and set down in a house without walls, beside a woman who slept through the whole of it. Her name was Yashoda, the mother who raised him, of the cowherd village. And she woke in the morning to a son, and she never had any reason to think otherwise. And the tellers, who could easily have made a sorrow out of this, mostly decline to. What they make out of it instead is the happiest stretch of the whole story. Gokul was a cowherd village and nothing more than that. It was a scatter of houses with thatch that had to be redone every second year, arranged with no plan at all around the places where the ground was firm. And beyond the houses were the pens, and beyond the pens was the grazing, and beyond the grazing was the river. The wealth of the place was measured in cattle, and in nothing else. Nobody there could read. Nobody there needed to. The headman of the cowherds was called Nanda, gentle and slow to worry, a broad, unhurried man who had grown into his position mostly by being the person that everyone naturally told things to. He was not clever. He was, in the way that matters in a village, wise, which is a different thing, and is mostly made of patience. And a village of that kind does not raise a child so much as absorb one. The boy belonged to his mother, certainly, but he also belonged to every woman with a courtyard between her house and the pens, and to every old man sitting in the shade with a stick, and to the 11 or 12 other boys of about his size, who ran in a loose pack from one end of the settlement to the other from the moment the sun was up. He was fed by whoever he was nearest to at the time. He was scolded by anyone. This is how children were raised there, and it is a good way. And Krishna had the whole of it, and never in his life afterward, in any city or any palace or on any battlefield, did he seem to want a different one. There is one dark hour in these years, and the tellers put it early and get it over with, and so will we. A woman came to the village who was not a woman. She came at the end of an afternoon, dressed well, smiling, asking after the new child in the way that visitors do, and she was made welcome. Because in a village with no walls, everyone is made welcome. She was allowed to hold him. What she intended is not something we will describe. It is enough to say that she offered him something, and that what she offered was not milk, and that the offering did not work, and that she went away from the village before the light was gone and did not come back, and was not seen again in any story afterward. The village found her frightening for a season, and then stopped talking about it, as villages do. And the child was perfectly well. That is all. The rest of these years is butter. The story tells us that he was a difficult child in exactly the way that is delightful to hear about and exhausting to live with. He was quick, and he was small, and he was extraordinarily hard to keep hold of. He undid the calves from their tethers because he liked to watch them go. He upset the water pots. He sat down in wet ground on purpose. And above all, and famously, and endlessly, he stole butter. You must understand what butter was there. Milk was the whole economy. It was set to curdle in wide clay pots, and churned in the early morning with a wooden staff pulled back and forth on a rope by a woman standing over it. And the sound of that churning at first light, from every courtyard at once, was the sound the village woke up to. What rose to the top of the churn was pale and sweet, and was the best thing anybody in that place ever tasted, and it was sold or traded or kept for the days that mattered, and it was certainly not left out where a child could reach it. So they hung it up. They hung the pots from the roof beams on ropes, high, well out of the way, and they thought that would be the end of it. It was not the end of it. He climbed. He stacked the mortar on the grinding stone and stood on it. He got the other boys to make a ladder of themselves, one on the shoulders of another, and he went up them like a lizard up a wall. He worked out that the pot could be broken from below with one accurate stone, and that the butter would then come down of its own accord, which is either a robbery or an engineering solution, depending on your view of children. And every second morning there was a delegation, and the delegation was about Krishna. Very slow, soft, low, and even, with unhurried pauses at the end of every sentence. Keep the energy calm and soothing throughout. This is the part of the story that everyone in that country knows, and that everyone tells with the same face. The milkmaids of the village would arrive in Yashoda's courtyard, several of them together, and they would stand there and complain. And the complaints were long and detailed and thoroughly enjoyed by everybody making them. He had been in the pots. He had let the calves at the cows before the milking. He had given the butter to the monkeys, which he had more than once, and had sat and watched them eat it with the expression of a man who has arranged a very fine evening for his friends. And Yashoda would apologize and mean it, and promise it would not happen again, and mean that too. And then the boy would be produced from wherever he had gone, with butter unmistakably on his face, and would look at his mother with an expression of transparent and total innocence. And every woman in that courtyard would lose the argument and go home laughing. They knew what they were doing. They came for the laughing. A village that poor takes its pleasures where it finds them, and one of the pleasures of Gokul for several years was being robbed by that particular child. Once, and only once, she caught him properly, and this is the day the story remembers. She had been churning, and the milk had gone over on the fire behind her, and she got up to save it, and in the moment her back was turned, he took the churn. When she came back, the pot was broken, and the butter was gone, and there was a trail of it going out of the door. And she went after him with the length of rope she had been churning with, honestly angry, And she caught him, which she had never done before. And she sat him down against the great stone mortar in the yard to tie him to it. And the rope was too short. She fetched another and knotted it on, and it was still too short by exactly the width of 2 fingers. She fetched a third, still too short. The women came to watch, and then to help, and there was soon a great length of rope going round that mortar, sashes and cords, and the ties off the cattle pens all knotted together. And it was never, not once, quite long enough. And the child sat there through all of it, and let them, and was very good, and said nothing, and looked at his mother. And in the end she stopped, and sat down on the ground beside him, out of breath, and gave up, and he leaned against her, and that was the end of it. The tellers say the ropes had failed on purpose, and that he let himself be tied a moment later because she was tired, and that both of those things are the same thing, and that this is the truest thing in the whole chapter. And then there is the other day, which is quieter, and which the village never knew about. The boys came running to say he had been eating earth. He denied it, in the manner of children, entirely unconvincingly. And Yashoda took his chin, and told him to open his mouth, so that she could see for himself. He opened his mouth. What she saw in there is the thing the whole story is really about, and the tellers describe it with a kind hush. She saw the sky in it. She saw the dark and the stars laid out across it, and the roads of them going away, and the seas and the mountains standing in their places, and the wind moving over standing crops in countries she had never heard of, and the year turning, and every living thing there had ever been going about its business, small and lit and complete. And somewhere far inside all of it she saw, for a moment, a village of thatch by a river, and a courtyard, and a woman kneeling on the ground in front of a child with her hand under his chin. The story says she stood there for a long time, and then it says that she chose to forget it. Not that she was made to forget, though some tellings say that too. It says that she looked at the whole of everything there is, and then closed his mouth, and wiped the dirt off his cheek with the edge of her sleeve, and told him not to eat earth, and picked him up and carried him inside, because it was late, and because whatever else he was hers, and he was 4, and he needed his supper. The evening came down over Gokul as it always did. The cattle went into the pens with that heavy, patient shoving they do at the end of a day. The fires were damped. Somewhere a woman was still complaining about her butter, without any real conviction, to a neighbor who had stopped listening. And in every courtyard in the village, the pots that had not been broken sat cooling in the dark, unbroken, and the milk in them settled, and the night came on. You will remember the cowherd village of Gokul, and the broken pots, and the rope that was never long enough. The village moved after a while. This happens in the story without much ceremony, and for the ordinary reasons that cattle people move. The grazing had been used hard for a long time, and there had been some trouble of the kind that made Nanda, the headman of the cowherds, gentle and slow to worry, sit up rather later than usual for several nights running. So the carts were loaded, and the pens were pulled apart, and the whole settlement went a few miles along the river to a place called Vrindavan, the forest of tulsi and long grass, and put itself down again there, among better pasture. And Vrindavan is where this story properly lives. Everything that anyone remembers best happens in this one small place, and the tellers slow right down when they arrive here, and so will we. It was a low country of open woodland running along the water. There were groves of old trees with room between them, so that the light came through in long slants in the morning, and went gold in the late afternoon, and did the thing that light does in such places, which is to make everything look as though it is being remembered rather than seen. There was tulsi growing wild and thick, which is a small green plant with a smell in its leaves that gets into your hands when you brush past it. There was grass higher than a boy's waist in the wet season, and the paths went through it like partings in hair. And there was the Yamuna, the dark, slow river, going along the edge of everything, wide and unhurried, with sandbanks in it, and turtles on the sandbanks, and long-legged birds standing about in the shallows, being patient. The boys took the cattle out in the morning, and brought them back in the evening, and that was the work, and it filled the days completely. The tellers are generous about these days, and give them a great deal of room, and this is not padding, it is the point. There were perhaps a dozen cowherd boys of an age, and they went out at first light with the herds and a little food tied in cloth, and they were gone until dusk, and what they did all day was mostly nothing. They swam, they climbed, they invented games with rules so elaborate that the games could not actually be played and had to be abandoned and reinvented daily. They lay on their backs under trees and argued about things that did not matter. They ate one another's food. They lost calves and found them again. They came home filthy every single evening and were shouted at by 12 different women and did not mind. And Krishna, the dark blue child of Gokul, who by now was the cowherd of Vrindavan, was at the middle of all of it, and was the one who thought of the games, and was, by common agreement, the best of them at everything except 1 or 2 things that he let the others be better at. Now, on that stretch of the river there was a pool. It lay in a bend where the water went slow and deep and turned back on itself. And it was black, and it was still, and nobody went near it. This was not superstition. You could see the reason from 30 paces. Very slow, soft, low, and even, with unhurried pauses at the end of every sentence. Keep the energy calm and soothing throughout. Read only the provided text. Do not add or improvise any extra words. The trees on the bank above it were dead on the side facing the water, and they had been dead a long time. Nothing grew along that edge. Birds crossing the river went around it rather than over it, in a wide, unhurried curve, as though the air itself over that water were somewhere they preferred not to be. And the cattle, which are not clever animals, would not go down to drink there, not even at the end of a hot day when they had walked a long way and the river was right in front of them. They would stand at the top of the bank with their heads up, and then turn and walk half a mile for water they liked better. In the pool there lived Kalia, the old serpent of the pool. The story is careful about him, and the care is worth noticing, because he could easily have been made into a simple horror, and he is not. He had not always been there. He had come to that bend of the Yamuna out of the sea, driven from his own place by something he was afraid of. And he had gone into the deepest water he could find, and stayed in it, and he had been there a very long time. He had wives, a great many of them, who lived there with him. He was old. What came off him and into the water was not malice. It was simply what he was, the way cold comes off ice. And it had been going into that pool for years, and had made the water what it was. He was, in short, a frightening thing that had arrived somewhere frightened, and had never left. And the tellers know exactly what that is, and they let you know that they know. One afternoon, the herds were grazing along the bank above the pool, and it was very hot. And a number of the cattle, and then a number of the boys, got at the water where they should not have, and were laid out on the sand within the hour, breathing badly, not waking. There was no argument about what to do, and no counsel, and no speech. Krishna went along the bank, and climbed a tree that leaned out over the black water, and stood on a branch of it for a moment looking down, and then jumped in. What follows is told, in every telling I know, as music rather than as a fight. The water closed. Nothing happened for a while, and the length of that while is the worst part of the story for everyone standing on the bank, and the tellers hold it exactly as long as it should be held, and no longer. Very slow, soft, low, and even, with unhurried pauses at the end of every sentence. Keep the energy calm and soothing throughout. Then the pool began to move and go on moving in the slow, heavy way that deep water moves when something large is turning over underneath it. And then the serpent came up. He came up enormous, in coils that broke the surface in several places at once, and with his many hoods spread wide. And the boys on the bank saw them, and they said afterward, less terrible than they had expected, and more tired. And the boy came up out of the water and stepped onto him. He did not strike him. This is the thing to hold on to. He stood on the wide flat of the nearest hood, and he began to dance. It was a slow dance and an unhurried one, and it went on a long time. He went from hood to hood as they rose, stepping across, keeping his weight easy, turning. And the great body under him twisted and rolled and heaved to be rid of him, and could not be. And every time a hood came up, he was already on it. The tellers say there was rhythm in it, and that from the bank it looked like nothing so much as a boy dancing on the surface of a moving black floor. And that after a while, and this is the strange tender part, it began to look less like a struggle and more like something being wound down. Like a bird being calmed by being held, like a fever going out of somebody. The serpent was old, and it had been afraid for a long time, and it was at last simply tired, and the dance went on until all of the fight was out of him, and then it stopped. And the wives came up out of the water and asked for his life. They asked well. They said, more or less, that he had done what he was made to do, and had not chosen his nature any more than the river had chosen to be wet, and that he had come there frightened, and that if he was to be ended for it, then they would like it understood that he had also been loved. And the cowherd of Vrindavan listened to all of it, standing on the hood of their husband in the middle of the river. And then he stepped down into the water and let him go. The terms were gentle and they were practical. Kalya was to leave the Yamuna, because he could not stay in a river that people drank from. He was to go back to the sea, which was his own country, and where the water was wide enough to hold what came off him without harm. The terms were gentle, and they were practical. Kalya was to leave the Yamuna, because he could not stay in a river that people drank from. He was to go back to the sea, which was his own country, and where the water was wide enough to hold what came off him without harm. And because the thing he had been afraid of out there would know him by sight, he was sent away marked, with the print of a small foot left on his hood, so that whatever had driven him into hiding would see that mark and let him alone. So the old serpent went down the river to the sea, slowly, with all his wives, and was not seen again, and was not, in the end, punished for anything. The boys on the sand woke up, coughing, extremely annoyed at having missed everything. And the pool cleared. It took a season, but the dead sides of the trees put out green the next spring, and the birds stopped going around, and the water in the bend went from black to the ordinary brown dark of a river with sand in it. By the following year, the cattle would go down there of their own accord in the evening, at that hour when the light is going, and the flies have finished, and the whole herd walks with its head low. And they would stand in the shallows at the bend with the water round their knees, and drink for a long time, unbothered, while the birds came back down onto the sandbank one after another to settle for the night.
You will remember the black pool at the bend of the river, and how it cleared, and how the cattle came down to it again in the evenings without fear. The year turned, as years do, and the rains ended, and the ground dried, and the grass went from green to gold. And then the cold weather came and went, and it was coming round again to the season when the whole country begins to look at the sky and wonder when the rain will start. And in Vrindavan, the forest of tulsi and long grass, as everywhere else in that country, there was a festival for it. The tellers describe the preparations at length, and the description is very warm, because the preparations were the best part. It was the largest thing the village did in the year. Grain that had been kept back was brought out. Every household gave what it could, and several gave more than they could in the way of villages, out of a quiet competitiveness that everybody pretended not to notice. The women cooked for 2 days. There were sweets that were only made this once. There were new clothes for the children, or clothes that had been let out and were being called new.
And all of it was for Indra, the king of the heavens, who sends the rain. And it was carried out with great care and considerable expense, so that he would be pleased, and would send the rain again, and the grass would live. And in the middle of the preparations, Krishna asked his father a question. He asked it, the story is careful to say, without any edge in it at all. He was not being clever, and he was not making a point. He asked Nanda, the headman of the cowherds, gentle and slow to worry, what the festival was for. And Nanda told him, and he thought about it, and then he asked what it was that actually fed them. And then he answered his own question, out loud, in front of a growing number of people, in the way that children do when they have followed a thought all the way to the end and are pleased with where it has arrived. He said, We are cowherds. We do not plow. We have no fields and no grain of our own worth speaking of. What we have is cattle, and what the cattle have is grass. And where the grass is the hill. The hill is what holds the water when the rain has gone. The hill is where the herds go in the hot weeks when the flat is burnt. Very slow, soft, low, and even, with unhurried pauses at the end of every sentence. Keep the energy calm and soothing throughout. Read only the provided text. Do not add or improvise any extra words. The hill has been standing there feeding us every single day of every year that anyone remembers, in good seasons and bad, and has never once been thanked for it. And the rain comes when it comes. It has come on the years we made the festival, and it has come on years when a village somewhere made no festival at all. And it will come this year. And it is rain, and it is doing what rain does. So, he said, let us take all of this out to the hill. Now, this could have been a quarrel. In other stories it is one. Here it is not. And the reason it is not is that he made them laugh. He was extremely good at making them laugh. He did not tell the elders they were fools. He turned the whole thing into an outing. The food is cooked. The sweets are made. The children are already in their clothes. And there is a perfectly good green hill sitting half a mile away that has fed us for 100 years. So let us take the whole feast up there, and eat it in the open, and walk round the hill, and go home happy. And because it was that kind of village, and because he was that kind of boy, they went. The hill was called Govardhan, the low green hill of the cowherds. It was not a mountain. Very slow, soft, low, and even, with unhurried pauses at the end of every sentence. It was a long, low rise of dark rock with good grass on it, and trees in the folds, and springs coming out along the base, and you could walk up it in an hour without hurrying. It was the most ordinary thing in that landscape, and it was the reason the landscape could be lived in. So the whole village went up it with the food, and the cattle were driven along too, and it turned into the best day of that year. People sitting about on rocks, eating things they only ate once a year. Children going flat out through the long grass. Old men pointing at parts of the hill and telling one another things about the hill that everyone already knew. And in the heavens, the story tells us, the king of the heavens noticed that his festival had not happened. He took it badly. The tellers, who like him well enough in the end, do not pretend otherwise. He was proud, and he was used to being attended to, and he had just been quietly and cheerfully set aside by a village of cowherds in favor of a hill. And so he sent weather. He sent it for 7 days. Here the story could become a terror, and it does not. And this is one of the places where this particular telling is at its gentlest. What is described is not a punishment. It is simply the very worst rain anyone had ever seen, described the way people describe great weather afterward, with a kind of awe that has all the fear worn off it. The sky came down until there was no difference between the air and the water in it. The river went out over its banks and took the low fields. The lanes of the village ran and then stood and then joined together, and by the second day there was no village, only thatch above water and the tops of the pans. And on the first evening of it, the whole of Vrindavan, every person and every animal, was at the foot of the hill, because that is where they had been when it started. And Krishna put his hand under the edge of the hill and lifted it. The tellers say he raised it on one finger, and they say it in a plain voice without any flourish. And then they move straight on to the part they are actually interested in, which is the week underneath, because that is what the story is about. It is not about the lifting. It is about 7 days of an entire village standing under a hill in the warm, dark, dry, with all their cattle around them, listening to the most enormous rain in the world coming down a few paces away and not touching them. They were, by every account, extremely comfortable. Children slept. The cattle, which had been badly frightened on the first afternoon, settled by the second day and stood chewing in the gloom with the patience of animals who have decided that somebody else is dealing with it. People talked. There was a good deal of food, because they had brought a festival's worth up the hill and had not finished it. Somebody had a small lamp, and it was passed about. The old men, who had been at the middle of everything for 100 years, found that this was a story they were inside of, rather than one they could tell, and were quiet for once, and did not mind. And the boy stood at the edge with his arm up, and the villagers came past him one at a time over the 7 days to look at him, because they could not help it. And every telling says that he was talking the whole while, and that most of it was nonsense, and that he was smiling. On the 7th day it stopped, the way rain does at the end of a great storm, all at once, and with a sort of embarrassment. And Indra came down. He came down and stood on the wet grass in front of a village of cowherds and apologized, which is a thing that does not happen often in any story, and the tellers give him credit for it. He said he had been proud. He said he had confused being thanked with being needed. He asked to be forgiven, and he was forgiven at once and lightly, and without a speech, which is the only way that forgiveness is worth anything. The boy said something short and kind. Then, because the King of the Heavens was standing there and had come a long way and clearly needed something to do, he was given a name to give, and he gave it, Govinda, keeper of cattle, which is a herdsman's name, a small one, and it is the name that stuck harder than any of the grand ones, and is still, a very long time afterward, the one people call out first. Then the hill was set down. The story is particular about this. It was set down exactly where it had been, not near where it had been. The grass along the line where it had rested came back up within the month. The springs ran where they had always run. There was no mark on the ground, and no hollow left, and nothing to show ever afterward that anything had happened there at all. And this is why the tellers say, people go and walk all the way round that hill to this day, slowly, at their own pace, in no hurry, because there is nothing to see. And that is the point. The water went down over the following week. The village came back out of the flood, muddy and pleased with itself. The pens were rebuilt, badly, the way they always were. And on the first clear evening after the rain, the whole flat country steamed gently as it dried, and the herds went out again onto the wet grass. And above the long dark line of the hill, the first star came out where it had always been. You will remember the hill that was held up for 7 days and set down again so carefully that no mark was left on the ground. We come now to the part of the story that the poets of that country have never been able to leave alone. More has been sung about this chapter than about all the rest of the life together, and almost none of it is about anything happening. It is about an evening, and a sound, and a great deal of longing. And the tellers slow down here more than anywhere, and go quiet, and take their time. It begins with a flute. Nobody says where he got it. In some tellings it is cut from a reed by the river in the ordinary way that cowherd boys have always cut flutes, 6 holes and a notch and an afternoon's work. And this is the version to keep, because it is the right size for the story. It was a common thing. Every 3rd boy in that country had one. They were played badly, at length, and mostly by people walking behind cattle who had nothing else to do with their hands. And Krishna played it in the evenings when the herds were coming home. What happened when he played it is the whole of this chapter, and it must be said carefully, because it can be said stupidly. Very slow, soft, low, and even, with unhurried pauses at the end of every sentence. Keep the energy calm and soothing throughout, Read only the provided text. Do not add or improvise any extra words. The tellers do not say that anyone was compelled. They say something stranger and better, that the sound went out over the village at the end of the day, and found the exact place in each person where they were most themselves, and pressed on it. So the work stopped. Not dramatically. It stopped the way work stops when you hear rain start, or a voice you know in the street outside. A woman with her hands in the grain would find that she had been standing still for some while. The one at the churn would stop pulling, and the rope would go slack, and she would not notice. Girls carrying water put the pots down on the path and stood there. Old men sat up. The cattle themselves went quiet, and this detail is in every telling, that the herds stopped their noise and stood with their heads turned, which anyone who has kept animals will tell you is not a small thing. And in the autumn, on the full moon at the end of the rains, they went out to the forest. The milkmaids of the village, the gopis as that country calls them, the young women and the not-so-young women of every household, heard the flute out of the trees along the river one night in that season, and they went out to it. Now here the story requires an honest note, and this telling will give it plainly rather than smuggle it past. Among all these women, in the songs and the paintings and the plays of the last many centuries, there is one who is named above the others, and her name is Radha. She is in every song. She is painted at his side more often than anyone. In a great deal of that country, she is named before he is. And the oldest tellings of this story do not have her in them at all. That is simply true, and it is not a scandal, and it takes nothing away. The very old books tell of the flute and the forest and the women of the village, and they do not give any one of them a name. The poets who came afterward, hundreds of years afterward, singing in their own languages, in the villages, in the temples, in the courts, could not bear that. They looked at that autumn night and felt that there had to have been one who loved him most, and one whom he could not stop looking for. And so they gave her to the story, and gave her a name, and the story took her in and closed around her as though she had always been there. And now she has always been there. So we will do what everybody in that country does, and tell her with our whole heart, and simply say once, out loud, that the later poets are the ones who loved her into the telling. That is the honest note. It is done. The forest at Vrindavan on a full autumn night is a place worth describing slowly, because the describing is most of what this chapter is. The rains had finished, so the air had gone clear and cool for the first time in months, and the sky was enormous. The grass along the river was high and pale and dry enough to whisper. The tulsi was in flower, and the smell of it came and went in the moving air. And the moon was full. And the moon in that season, in that flat country, on a night with no dust in the air, does not so much light the ground as replace the day with a quieter version of itself. Everything visible, everything the color of ash and silver, the shadows of the trees lying out sharp and black across the open ground, the river a long band of moving pale between its banks. They came out along the paths through the grass, 1 and 2 and 3 at a time, and they found him by the river. And what happened, according to the oldest accounts, is that they made a circle and danced. That is all that is described, and the restraint is deliberate, and this telling will keep it. There is no intimacy staged in the old books, and there will be none here. There is a wide place by the river, and a ring of figures moving slowly on the pale ground, and the flute somewhere in the middle of it, and moonlight, and a great deal of night on every side. Seen from any distance at all, and the tellers do tend to pull back and look at it from a distance, it would have been a small pale circle turning very slowly in an enormous dark forest, and the sound of it would have carried a long way over the water and then been lost. What the poets have spent 1,000 years on is not the dance. It is what he did in the middle of it. He went away. At the height of that night, with all of them there, and the circle turning, and the whole thing at its most perfect, he was simply not there anymore, and the forest was very large and very quiet and full of moonlight, and there was no flute anywhere in it. And so the second half of the night, which is the part everyone remembers, was the searching. Very slow, soft, low, and even, with unhurried pauses at the end of every sentence. Keep the energy calm and soothing throughout. Read only the provided text. Do not add or improvise any extra words. They went through the woods looking for him. They asked the trees. This is in the oldest book, and it is the loveliest thing in it. They went from tree to tree along the river, asking whether he had come this way, asking the tulsi, asking the deer, asking the river itself, and getting no answer, and going on asking. They found a place where the grass was pressed down, and stood around it. They found nothing else. And then, having failed to find him, they sat down together in the grass, and began, in the dark, to talk about him. and then to sing about him. They told one another the whole of Krishna from the beginning, the butter, the calves, the ropes, the pool, the hill, the 7 days underneath it. They did the voices. They laughed, and then they did not laugh. And by the end of that night, out in the forest, without him, with nothing but each other and the moon going down, they had made the songs that country has been singing ever since. That is the point of it, and the tellers say so directly. The missing was not a punishment, and it was not a trick. What he had given them by going was the one thing they could not have had while he was standing there, the whole of him, held in the mind, at a distance, wanted. And that turns out to be a thing you can carry with you and keep, and go on carrying long after the night has ended, whereas a boy by a river is only ever there until he is not. So the longing in this story is not a wound. It is the sweetest thing in it, and everyone who tells it knows that. And this is why a chapter in which nothing whatever is achieved is the one that is sung. Toward morning he came back, or was found, or had been there all along, in the way that these accounts allow. The circle formed again, more slowly, and turned, and the sky over the river went from black to gray without anyone noticing exactly when. And then the night ended, as nights do, and they walked home along the paths through the long grass with their sandals in their hands, and the dew coming off the seed heads onto their arms. And the village woke up around them, and the churns started, and the day began, and nobody said anything about any of it to anyone. Down by the water, on a flat stone at the edge, where the boys always left things, the flute was lying where it had been put down. Cool now, with the dew on it, going quiet as the river went past below it, and carried the last of the sound away downstream in the dark. You will remember the moonlit river, and the circle turning in the long grass, and the flute left lying on a flat stone at the edge of the water. The chariot came at evening. The tellers always put it at evening, and always have the village see it first from a long way off, coming along the river road with the low sun behind it, and always have somebody say, in the way that villages say such things, that a wheel like that has not been on this road in living memory. In it was a Krura, the kinsman sent with the chariot, whose heart was divided. He came from Mathura. He was a decent man in a difficult position, which is the hardest thing to be in any story. And he had been sent by the king of that city with an invitation, and he knew perfectly well what the invitation was underneath, and he had come anyway, because refusing would have meant somebody else coming instead and being less careful about it. The invitation was to a festival, and to the great bow that was to be shown at it, and to a wrestling match. It was addressed to the two brothers, to Krishna, the cowherd of Vrindavan, and to Balarama, his elder brother, fair as the moon, strong as the plough, who had grown up in that same village and had been in the middle of everything in it. "Come and see the city," it said. "Come and be our guests." They went out to meet the chariot on the road, the two of them, with the cattle still coming in behind them, and the dust of the herd hanging in the light. And Akrura got down, and did not know for a moment what to do with his face, and then did what people always do in this part of the story, which is to give up entirely on being a diplomat. He told them the truth, that the invitation was a hook, and that he had known it when he took it, and that they should come anyway, because the time for the two of them to be cowherds was finished, and everybody standing on that road knew it. They said they would come in the morning, and so the village had one night. This is the great sorrow of the whole story, and the tellers know it, and they handle it exactly the way they handle every hard hour in this life, which is at a distance, in the past tense, with the ending said first. So let it be said first. Vrindavan did not lose him. That is how it ends. The forest has him still. The songs of that one autumn night are sung in places those women could not have imagined. The flute is heard in that grass by people who were born 3,000 years after any of them died. Nothing was taken away from that village permanently, only immediately. But immediately is what a village feels. The old accounts do not describe the night, and this telling will not either. It is enough to know that there was one, and that nobody slept much, and that in the morning the whole settlement was standing on the road in the half-dark before the sun, every one of them, the old man and the boys and the milkmaids and the mothers, and that the chariot went away south along the river, with the light coming up behind it, and that they stood in the road and watched it until it was a smudge, and then until it was nothing, and then went on standing there for a while afterward, looking at the empty road, which is the part that anyone who has ever done it will recognize. Then they went and milked the cattle, because the cattle do not care, and that is a mercy. The road took a day and a night. And at dawn, on the second morning, the two brothers came up out of the flat country, and saw a city for the first time in their lives. Mathura at sunrise, from the north road, with the river beside it. Walls which they had never seen. Roofs behind roofs behind roofs going up. Smoke standing straight in the cold air from 1,000 hearths at once. The noise of it, which reaches you before the city does, a low, continuous sound made of carts and animals and people that has no single part you can point at, and the smell, which in that country is grain and dung smoke and marigold and dust and drains, and over everything the river. They walked in through the gate like the two provincial boys they were, staring. The story now gives 3 small encounters on the way in, and they are told as 3 doors, and one of them does not open. The first was a washerman coming from the river with a load of clothes for the king's household. They stopped him and asked pleasantly whether they might have something better to wear than what they had walked in, since they were going to a festival. He looked at them and saw 2 cowherds with river mud on their feet, and he refused. And he was not merely refusing, he was enjoying refusing. And he said several things about where they had come from. It went badly for him. The tellers pass over exactly how in a single clause, and this telling will do the same, and will only note that of the 3 people the brothers met on that road, he was the one who had been given a chance and had spent it. The second was a garland maker, who had a stall along the same street, and who saw the same 2 dusty strangers, and came out from behind his flowers, and gave them the best he had, both hands full of it, and would not take anything for it. He asked for nothing. He was asked what he wanted, and could not think of anything, and eventually said that he would like to go on being the kind of man who did that, which the tellers regard as the single wisest answer anybody gives in this entire chapter. And the third was a woman going up the same street with a jar of sandal paste for the king, and it is Krishna she met, though she did not know it. She was bent, badly bent, in 3 places, from some old injury or long illness, so that she went sideways and slowly, and had done for years, and was known in that street for it. She gave them the paste freely, laughing at herself for doing it. And the dark lord of Mathura, as he was about to become, put his fingers under her chin and lifted, and set his foot lightly on her feet, and straightened her. The story says she stood up. It says she was suddenly a tall woman, and a rather handsome one, and that she did not know what to do with her hands. And it does not make her a saint afterward, and does not make her a lesson. It simply lets her be somebody's aunt in a street in Mathura who was bent on a Tuesday and was not bent on a Wednesday, which is the sort of thing that happens in this story to people who are kind to strangers in the road. Then there was the bow. It stood in a hall under guard, enormous, the pride of the city, brought out once a year to be looked at. Nobody had strung it in generations. It was not really meant to be strung. It was meant to be admired. And it does not make her a saint afterward, and does not make her a lesson. It simply lets her be somebody's aunt in a street in Mathura who was bent on a Tuesday and was not bent on a Wednesday, which is the sort of thing that happens in this story to people who are kind to strangers in the road. Then there was the bow. It stood in a hall under guard, enormous, the pride of the city, brought out once a year to be looked at. Nobody had strung it in generations. It was not really meant to be strung. It was meant to be admired. Very slow, soft, low, and even, with unhurried pauses at the end of every sentence. Keep the energy calm and soothing throughout. They walked in to look at it because they were tourists, and he picked it up out of curiosity, and put a knee to it, and drew the string up to the notch, and it broke. The noise of it going was heard, the tellers say, across the whole city. And this is the moment when Mathura understood that something had come in through its gate. And in the morning there was the wrestling ground. It is described in early light, and it is a fine description. An open square of beaten earth in the middle of the city, with the tiers of seats going up around it, and dew on the wooden rails, and the crowd coming in with their breath showing. Every seat filled. The king in his gallery, having not slept as usual. Down in the enclosure the champions of Mathura, who were very large men indeed, and who had been told, without much being said, exactly what was expected of them. The rest of that morning is told the way this story always tells its dark hours, quickly and at a distance, and with the ending given before the beginning. So, it ended well. It ended with the doors of a prison being opened. Now, the little that must be said in between. The two brothers went down into the enclosure, and the matches went against the city. And the king rose from his gallery, and it came at last to the two of them, the cousin and the child he had spent 20 years being afraid of, in an open square in front of everybody. And it was very short. And Kamsa, the king of Mathura, who could not sleep, was not, in the end, killed by a prophecy or by a monster, but by a young man from a cattle village, who had been carried past his guards as a newborn in a rainstorm. And the whole thing was over before the crowd on the far side had properly stood up. The tellers give him one line afterward, and it is not a triumphant one. They say only that he had ruined his own life over a sentence heard in a street, and that if he had done nothing at all when he heard it, nothing at all would have happened to him. And then, that same morning, they went and opened the prison. The story tells this simply, and it is the best moment in the chapter. Two young men walking down a passage past the guard-room, and a barred door at the end of it, and the bar lifted, and inside, in a room they had never seen, a man and a woman who had been in it for 20 years and more. Devaki, the mother who bore him in a locked room, was brought out into daylight for the first time since her wedding chariot had stopped in the street. Vasudeva, his father, who had carried a child across a river in the rain, came out beside her. They had had 2 sons and had raised neither. They were older than they should have been. The tellers say the 4 of them stood in the passage for a long while, and that nobody could speak. And then they leave them alone, which is right. The old grandfather, who had been the rightful king before his own son took the throne from him, was fetched out of wherever he had been kept and put back on it. There was no seizing of power and no new king crowned, which surprises people who expect the other kind of story. The 2 brothers simply handed the city back to the man it had belonged to, and stayed on as somebody's grandsons. And that evening Mathura lit its lamps, not for a festival, and not because anyone had ordered it. Only the ordinary lamps that a city lights at dusk, in the windows and along the parapet above the river gate, put out one at a time by ordinary people at the ordinary hour, in a city where, that night, nobody had any particular reason to be afraid. You will remember the opened prison in Mathura, and the 4 people standing in the passage outside it, who could not think of anything to say. What follows in the story is a quiet stretch, and the tellers seem glad of it, and let it run at its own pace. Krishna and his brother were sent to school. There is something very pleasing about this, and the old books know it and enjoy it. The one who had lifted a hill was packed off with a bundle of clothes to sit on the floor of a hut and learn his letters like everybody else, because that was what was done with young men of good family, and because nobody, least of all him, suggested that an exception should be made. The school belonged to Sandipani, the teacher by the sea, and it stood far to the west of Mathura, near the coast, which meant a long journey and a landscape none of them had seen. The country going dry and then stony, and then, one afternoon, the smell of salt coming in on the wind hours before there was anything to look at, and then the sea itself, gray-green and enormous and moving, in front of 2 young men from a river village who had never in their lives seen water that did not have a far bank. The school was a handful of huts under trees, and the teaching was done in the old way, which is to say, slowly, and mostly by living in the same yard as the teacher. There were perhaps a dozen students. They swept the floors and fetched the wood and cooked and studied, and the days had a shape to them, and the shape was the same every day, which is the whole method. And what a god learns is the ordinary curriculum, and the tellers list it without any awe at all. Letters, numbers, the songs, the law, the reading of the seasons, the handling of horses, the bow. He learned it, they say, rather quickly. He was, by every account, extremely good company in that yard, and no trouble at all. And the other students remembered him for the rest of their lives. And one of them we will come back to in a later chapter. A thin, poor, easily embarrassed boy called Sudama, who was his particular friend there, and who went home afterward to a very hard life, and never once mentioned to anyone that he had known him. At the end of it, the teacher was owed his fee, and asked for a thing that no fee could cover, a son of his, lost years before at sea. And the story says it was done, and does not linger, and the boy came back, and the school closed its year, and the students went home. And when he came back to Mathura, he came back with a friend. The friend was Uddhava, his friend of the clear mind. Uddhava is one of the best people in this story, and he is easy to miss. He was a cousin, older by a little, and he was the sort of man who thinks well, careful, honest, well-read, entirely without cruelty and entirely without illusions. He asked good questions. He noticed when an argument had a hole in it, including his own arguments. In a story crowded with people who feel enormously, he is the one who understands, and the tellers are very fond of him, and they are about to do something to him that they clearly enjoy doing, because a message needed to go to Vrindavan. It had been a long time, years by now. Very slow, soft, low, and even, with unhurried pauses at the end of every sentence. Keep the energy calm and soothing throughout. The two brothers had gone south in a chariot at dawn, and had not come back. And the reasons were good, and the reasons were real. A city to settle, a grandfather to see steady on a throne, a school on the far coast, and the plain fact that the boy who had left was not going to fit back into the life he had left. But none of that is any use at all to the people standing in the road. So Krishna asked Uddhava to go. Take the chariot. Tell them where I have been. Tell them I have not forgotten them. Tell them, he said, what I am, and what that means, and why the missing is not the thing they think it is. And Uddhava, who was good at exactly that sort of explaining, went. The story of that journey is one of the strangest and gentlest things in the whole tradition. He came into the village at evening, and the tellers do the arrival slowly and beautifully. He came in on the road they had all stood on, in the same kind of chariot, and the whole of Vrindavan came out again, and this time it was not him. And you can see from a distance the moment when they all realize it, and the way they cover it up at once out of politeness, and are extremely kind to the stranger, which is worse. Nanda, the headman of the cowherds, gentle and slow to worry, sat with him half the night asking about his son. Not about the city, or the throne, or the wrestling ground, about whether he was eating. Uddhava answered everything, and went to bed, and lay awake. And in the morning he went to deliver the message to the women of the village. He had prepared it well. He was a clear thinker, and he had a good deal to say, and all of it was true. That what they were mourning had never actually gone anywhere. That a thing loved that deeply is not somewhere else. That the missing itself was the proof of it, and not the loss of it. And that if they could put down the grief, they would find him exactly where they had left him, which was inside. He said it well, and the milkmaids of the village listened to him with enormous courtesy. And then a bee came in at the window and landed on the flowers by the sill. And one of them began to talk to the bee instead. That is what happens. That is the whole famous scene. He is not shouted at, and he is not argued with. He is simply, gently talked past.
They addressed themselves to the bee, and they said everything to the bee that a person says when they are not going to say it to the visitor. That it went from flower to flower, and that they knew all about that. That it had a sweet voice, and that they had met sweet voices before. That it should go back and tell the one who sent it that they were perfectly all right, thank you, and that they had already understood everything he had so kindly explained, and that understanding it had turned out to make no difference whatsoever. It is done with wit, and it is done with tenderness, and it is not in any telling cruel. They were teasing him, and they liked him, and they gave him food afterward. But they had shown him something, and they knew they had, which was this. He had come out from the city with a philosophy to explain to a group of village women why their longing was unnecessary. And he went home understanding that their longing was not a mistake in need of correction.
It was the highest thing anyone in the story had achieved, and they had got there without a single book. And he, who had read all the books, and who was right about every single thing he had said, had not got there at all. The old accounts say he stayed for months. He had meant to stay for days. He walked the paths through the long grass. He sat by the pool at the bend of the river. He stood on the hill at evening. He talked to old men who could not construct an argument to save their lives, and who knew more than he did. And he stopped correcting anybody. And at some point he stopped taking notes. And when at last he went back, he did not bring an answer with him, because there had not been a question. He brought, the tellers say, only the wish that he might come back some day as anything at all in that place. A plant on the path, a stone in the water, so long as the dust of it went over him occasionally. He is one of the wisest men in the story, and this is the one journey of his life anybody remembers. And it is the journey where he was defeated by a bee. The chariot went out of Vrindavan on the river road early, before the heat, the way everything leaves that village. The women had come to see him off, which they had not done when he arrived. Somebody had put a garland on the rail. There was mist standing in the low ground between the trees, waist high, with the tops of the grass coming through it. And the road ran south along the water, and the chariot went along it and got smaller, and the sound of the wheels went out of hearing before the shape of it did. And then there was only the empty road again in the early light, and the mist, and the birds starting. You will remember the friend of the clear mind who went to Vrindavan to explain something, and came back months later having stopped explaining things. The trouble came from the east, and it came the way trouble usually comes to a city, which is repeatedly and for reasons that have very little to do with the people it lands on. The old king of Mathura had had daughters, and those daughters had been married eastward, and one of the fathers-in-law was a great power in that direction. And when the king of Mathura died on the wrestling ground, his death became, for that great power, a grievance that could be carried usefully for years. So armies came up the river road. They came in the dry season when armies could move, and they went away in the rains when they could not. And then the next year they came again. The tellers do not make battles of these. They make seasons of them, which is closer to how it feels from inside a city. There would be a spring of it, and then a summer of quiet, and then word from up Riftribben. Trade stopped and started. The granaries were watched. People got used to it, which is the worst part. And then a generation of children grew up who did not know that a year could pass without any of that in it. And after a long time of this, the thing that was done about it was not a battle. It was a departure. Krishna moved the entire people. The tellers are honest about what that costs. It is presented as the right decision and also as a grief, and both at once. And they do not resolve it, because it does not resolve. To move a people is to give up the ground your grandparents are buried in. It is to leave the river you learned to swim in. There were households in Mathura that had been in the same 3 rooms for 150 years. There were old people carried out of it who understood perfectly well that they were seeing the place for the last time, and who did not complain, which is worse than complaining. And it saved every one of them, which is the other half. And the tellers make sure you know that too. Nobody died in a siege. Nobody was on a wall. The armies came the following year and found a city with nothing in it, and stood about in the empty streets, and had won, and had nothing. They went west. It was a long way, and it was hard country in the middle, and at the far end of it was the sea. And on the sea they built Dwarka, the city with many gates, built on the water. The building of it is told the way this story tells its happiest passages, which is slowly and in great physical detail, and it is one of the best stretches of the whole life to fall asleep in. There is a stretch of coast, and a headland, and shallow green water over pale sand, and the tide going a long way out, and coming a long way in. And they began at the low water line, and worked outward. They sank stone. They quarried it inland, and brought it down on carts, and sank it in courses. And the sea took the first of everything they did, and they did it again. They learned the water. They learned which weeks it would let them work, and which it would not. They found the deep channel, and left it. And they built the wall to follow the ground under the water, rather than a line drawn on a plan, so that the shape of the city was decided by the shape of the seafloor, which is why the tellers say it never had a straight side anywhere. Then the platforms, then the ways between them. Then the wells, which were the difficult part, and which they got right, and which is the reason the place could exist at all. And then, at last, the gates. There were a great many of them. Every account gives a different number, and every account gives a large one. And the name of the city simply means the place of many doors. They faced every way. There were gates that opened on the land road, and gates that opened on nothing but water, with steps going down into it where the boats came in. It took years. The tellers give it years, and describe the seasons of the work, and describe the town of workers' huts on the shore that became a quarter of the city later on, and describe the first night that the wall was closed all the way round, and people slept inside it. And when it was done, there was a city standing out in the sea, with the tide moving through under its causeways. And at night the lamps of it went a long way over the water, and it could not be besieged by anybody, and it never was. In the middle of the building of it there is a letter. Rukmini, the princess who wrote him a letter, lived far to the south, and she had never met him. She had heard about him for years. In a country like that, at that time, what a young woman of that rank had was travelers and singers and the talk of a court, and she had listened to all of it. and she had made up her mind on the evidence which the tellers regard as entirely reasonable. Her brother had made up his mind differently, and had promised her elsewhere, and the wedding was set, and it was days away. So she wrote. The letter is famous, and the tellers quote it warmly. And what is striking about it is how practical it is. It is not a swooning letter. It states the position. This is who I am. This is what has been arranged for me. This is the day it happens, and here is the exact hour and the exact place. She was to go up to the temple outside the walls on the morning of the wedding, as brides of that country did. And if you are coming, that is when to come, and that is where I will be. He came. It is done at dawn, and it is done quickly, and there is almost no violence in it. And the tellers rather enjoy the practicality of the whole thing. She came out of the temple and got into the chariot, and they were away down the road before the household had understood. And there was a certain amount of pursuit, and it was seen off, mostly by Balarama, his elder brother, fair as the moon, strong as the plough, who is at his best in this chapter, and who talked more people out of fighting than he fought. And then, having begun as a rescue, it became a household. That is the part the story cares about. The rescue is one morning. The marriage is 50 years, and they were good ones. She was the first of his queens, and there were others. And Satyabhama's name is the one that comes next. And the accounts are frank that it was a large household and a complicated one, and that it worked. There were children, and then grandchildren. There were mournings. There were arguments about nothing. The tellers, having spent 9 chapters on wonders, spend a genuinely happy stretch here on a man in middle age walking about in his own courtyard in the early morning with nothing much to do. And in the middle of those quiet years, somebody came to the gate. He came a long way on foot, and he was old before his time, and he was very thin, and his clothes were what he had. This was Sudama, the poor friend of his school days, from the yard by the sea, who had gone home from that school to a hard life, and had stayed in it, and who had never once told anybody who he had sat beside on that floor. His wife had made him come. He had refused for years. And you do not arrive at a king's house with nothing. So she had gone round the neighbors and got together a few handfuls of beaten rice, the cheap flattened rice that poor people eat, and tied it in a corner of cloth, and put it in his hand, and sent him off with it. He walked to the sea. He got through the gates by saying his name, which he had expected not to work. And by the time he was standing in the courtyard, he had understood exactly how ridiculous the bundle in his fist was, and he put it behind his back. And the tellers say that Krishna came across that courtyard fast, and took hold of him, and sat him down on his own seat, and washed his feet himself with water in a bowl, and then, still talking, reached round behind him, and took the little cloth out of his hand, and untied it, and ate the beaten rice, and would have eaten all of it if his wife had not taken it off him. Sudama stayed some days. He never asked for anything. That is in every telling, and it is the whole of his character. He talked about the school. He went home. And what the story gives him is not a speech and not a lesson. It is that he walked back up the road he had come down, still poor, having asked for nothing and been given nothing, and came over the last rise expecting his own 2 rooms, and found a house standing there instead, with his wife in the doorway of it. The years went on like that. The city held. The tide came in under the causeways twice a day, and went out again, and the gates were shut at dusk in the ordinary way, and the lamps came on along the sea wall, one after another, and out beyond them the water went dark and enormous and quiet, and the whole place stood there in the middle of it, lit and safe and asleep. You will remember the city with many gates standing out in the sea, and the lamps along its wall, and the long, quiet middle of a life. Far inland, in the old country to the northeast, there was a family. It was one family, and that is the thing to hold on to through everything that follows, because it is the reason the story is sad rather than exciting. It was one house with 2 branches, cousins, raised in the same rooms, taught by the same old teachers, put through the same exercises in the same yard by the same weapons master, who loved all of them and was going to have to watch. On one side there were 5 brothers. On the other there were a great many, 100 by the reckoning the story uses, and the eldest of them was the one who mattered. The quarrel began small, as these things do, and the tellers are unusually clear-eyed about it. It began with a boy who was slightly better at everything than another boy, and with an inheritance that had been divided in a way that was defensible and not quite fair, and with an old blind father who could not bring himself to say a hard thing to his own son. There was no villain at the start. Very slow, soft, low, and even, with unhurried pauses at the end of every sentence. Keep the energy calm and soothing throughout. Read only the provided text. Do not add or improvise any extra words. There was only a grievance that was never lanced, kept in a warm place for 20 years. And then there was the dice. 4 sentences, as promised, because it is the ugliest hour in that whole epic, and it is not what we are here for. The 5 brothers were invited to a game. The game was crooked, and everyone in the hall knew it. They lost, in order, their wealth, their kingdom, their freedom, and finally, and this is the thing that could never afterward be taken back, their wife was dragged into that hall and shamed in front of the whole court. And of all the men sitting there, the elders and the teachers and the blind king, not one of them stood up. And afterward it was smoothed over, and the terms were softened, and the 5 went into exile for 13 years instead. And everybody in that hall told themselves it had been settled. It had not been settled. Nothing that happens in that room ever goes anywhere. It sits for 13 years. The 13 years passed the way exile does, slowly, in forests, and the story of them belongs to another telling than this one. And at the end of them, the 5 came back and asked for what had been agreed, which was their half of the kingdom returned. It was refused. Then they asked for 5 villages, 1 each, not a kingdom, not a throne, 5 villages, and they said plainly that they would take that and be quiet. And that was refused too, in the most famous refusal in that country's memory. Not so much land, the answer came back, as would fit on the point of a needle. Between those 2 refusals there was an embassy, and this is where the story we are telling walks back into the middle of things. Krishna went himself. That is the part worth sitting with. The lord of the city in the sea, who had no stake in that inheritance and no border with either side, and could have stayed at home on the coast with the tide going in and out under his causeways, got into a chariot and traveled inland to a hostile court to try to stop a war between 2 sets of cousins, and he went alone, and he knew it would fail. The tellers give him the whole afternoon of it. He was courteous. He was patient beyond any reasonable measure. He put the case for peace 3 or 4 different ways, coming at it from the law, and then from the family, and then from the plain arithmetic of what a war does to the people who did not start it. He asked, in the end, for the 5 villages, and made it as easy as it could possibly be made to say yes. And it was refused, and there was an attempt to seize him in the hall, which failed, and which embarrassed everybody, and he walked out and went back to his chariot, and the thing was decided. On the road home he stopped, and this is a small moment the story never leaves out. He went to see the mother of the 5, who was an old woman by then, and who had been the sister of his own father, and who had had her sons taken away from her for 13 years. He sat with her for a while. He told her there would be a war. He did not soften it. And she, the accounts say, sent a message to her sons which was not a mother's message at all, and which said, in effect, that the hour they had all been raised for had come, and that she had not raised them to sit down. Then both sides went looking for allies, and both sides came to Dwarka on the same morning. The tellers enjoy this enormously. Very slow, soft, low, and even, with unhurried pauses at the end of every sentence. Keep the energy calm and soothing throughout. The two men arrived within an hour of each other, and were both shown in, and he was asleep, and they waited, one sitting up by the head of the couch, and one sitting down by the feet. And when he woke, he saw the one at his feet first. And what Krishna offered them is the strangest bargain in the epic, and it is offered evenly and without any trick in it. He said, "On one side, my army, all of it, every man, the whole strength of this city, which is not small, and which will fight for whichever of you takes it. On the other side, myself, alone, unarmed. I will not lift a weapon in this war. I will not command. I will drive a chariot if I am asked to. That is all I will be." And he let the younger of the two choose first, because he had seen him first. Arjuna, the archer, his friend, who set his bow down, and we will come to that in the next hour, chose the man without the weapon, and did not hesitate, and did not explain. And the other went away with an entire army, and could hardly believe his luck, and the tellers give him that without any sneering, because from where he was standing he was obviously right. So the two sides gathered, all through that winter, from every direction. Very slow, soft, low, and even, with unhurried pauses at the end of every sentence. Keep the energy calm and soothing throughout. Read only the provided text. Do not add or improvise any extra words. The old accounts spend a long time listing who came from where, and it is not a list this telling needs. What matters is the size of it. Every ruling house of that whole country sent men, because everyone was related to somebody, and because a family quarrel at that level is never allowed to stay a family quarrel. Grandfathers came out of retirement to fight for the side they had sworn to, rather than the side they loved. Teachers came to fight their own students. A great deal of the marching was done by men who had no idea what the disagreement had originally been about, which is true of all of them. And they came together on a wide flat plain in the north called Kurukshetra, the wide plain where the two houses met. and they made their camps at either end of it. And the winter nights out there were cold and enormous and full of fires. And then there was the morning. The tellers pull all the way back for it, and this telling will pull back further, and look at it from as far off as it can be looked at. From a great distance, at first light, on a plain that goes to the horizon in every direction, there are two shapes on the ground. They are dark, and they are very large, and they are perfectly still, and they are perhaps 2 miles apart. Between them is empty ground with frost on it. There is mist lying in the low places, and it is beginning to lift. Behind one of the shapes, the sky is going the color of the inside of a shell. There is no noise yet. Then there is one long, low sound, and another answering it from the far side, and then a great many of them together, and even that, from far enough away, is not a blast, but a kind of humming in the ground, the way thunder is when it is a long way off, and you feel it in your feet before you hear it. And it goes on for a while, and then it stops, and the plain is quiet again, and the sun is not up, and nothing has happened yet. That is where this hour ends, not with anything begun, only with the light coming, and the mist going off the grass, and 2 armies standing still, and facing one another on a wide, cold plain, and everything on it for 1 more hour still possible. You will remember the 2 hosts standing still on the cold plain in the early light, and the mist going off the grass between them, and how nothing had happened yet. What happened first was that one man asked to be driven forward. Arjuna, the archer, his friend, who set his bow down, was the finest bowman of that whole age, and had spent his entire life becoming it. He was not a doubter by nature. He was the least hesitant person on that field. And he asked his charioteer, before anything began, to take him out into the empty ground in the middle between the 2 armies, so that he could see who it was he had come to fight. And Krishna did it. He took the chariot out and stopped it in the middle of the plain, at the place where a man can see both ends of the thing at once, and let him look. And that was the whole of it. That was all it took, because what he saw from out there was not 2 armies. From out there they were near enough to have faces. On one side and on the other he saw the same family. He saw the old man who had held him as a child, and who had taught him how to hold a bow, and who was standing in the front rank opposite. He saw his own teacher over there. He saw cousins he had grown up wrestling with in a yard. He saw men he had eaten with on both sides, and men whose weddings he had gone to, and men whose fathers had carried him about on their shoulders when he was small. And every single one of them had got up that morning and put on armor and come out here to do this. And he sat down in the chariot and put the bow down on the floor of it and said that he would not. The tellers are very careful with him here, and they never once make him a coward. And this telling will keep that carefully. He was not afraid. He said so, and it was true, and everybody knew it. What had happened was simpler and worse. He had looked at the thing he was for, the thing he had trained every day of his life to be able to do, and had seen clearly for the first time what doing it would actually cost, and could not find anywhere in himself a reason good enough. And then, on the floor of a stopped chariot, in the middle of a plain with 2 armies waiting, Krishna answered him. And that answer is the song, and it is the most remembered conversation in that whole country, and people have carried it in their pockets for thousands of years. It is a very long conversation, and this is a sleep story. And so what follows is not the whole of it, and does not pretend to be. It is what a person remembers of it afterward, said slowly, the way you would say it to somebody lying in the dark. He began with the grief itself, because that was what was in front of him. He said that grief of this kind is spent on the wrong thing, that the part of a person which is actually the person was never made, and cannot be unmade, and does not begin at a birth or stop at a death, any more than the sky begins at the edge of a window. That what is put down at the end of a life is put down the way clothes are put down at the end of a day, and what puts them down goes on. He did not say this to make the death of anybody unimportant. He said it, the tellers are clear, to a man who was about to be destroyed by the fear of causing an ending. And the whole weight of it is, the ending you are so afraid of is not as final as your fear believes. Then he spoke about the work. And this is the part that people who have never read a word of it still somehow know. He said that the doing is yours, and the harvest is not. That a person has a right to the action in front of them, and no right at all to decide what it will come to, and that almost all human misery is made in the gap between those two things, in doing the work with one eye permanently on the result, so that the work is never actually done, and the result never actually arrives. Do the thing because it is the thing that is yours to do. Let go of the accounting, not because the outcome does not matter, but because it was never in your hands to begin with. And holding on to something that is not in your hands is simply a way of hurting your hands. And out of that comes the steadiness he kept coming back to. A person settled in that way, he said, is not made cheerful by good news or destroyed by bad. Not because they feel nothing. This is not a recommendation of coldness anywhere in the song, but because their footing is not in the weather. He described such a person several times over, from several directions, and every description comes to the same picture. Somebody who can be in the middle of anything and still be entirely there, the way a lamp burns steadily in a room out of the wind. Very slow, soft, low and even, with unhurried pauses at the end of every sentence. Keep the energy calm and soothing throughout. Then Arjuna asked what anybody would ask, which was, how? And the answer to that is the most generous thing in the song, and it is the reason it has lasted. He said, by more than one road. There is the road of doing, of work offered up, done well and let go of, which is the road of people whose lives are made of tasks. There is the road of knowing, of thinking it through honestly and all the way down, which is the road of people built like that. And there is the road of simple love, of turning toward it with the whole heart, the way the milkmaids in a village turned toward a flute at evening, which asks no learning at all and is open to anybody. He was not ranking them. The song says quite plainly that people come by every road there is, and that they arrive, and that the one who arrives on the humblest of them has arrived exactly as much as anyone else. Whatever is offered honestly, he said, and the line is famous, a leaf, a flower, a fruit, a little water, is received as what it is. And then, because Arjuna asked to see, he was shown. The tellers slow almost to a stop here, and they describe it as light and as size. Everything at once and everywhere, all the worlds and all the ages of them, the beginnings and endings of things happening simultaneously, all held in one place, and the whole of that plain and both of those armies, and the two men in the chariot in the middle of it, turning out to be one small, ordinary detail inside it. It is described as beautiful, and it is described as unbearable, and both are meant. And after a while, the archer asked, in a small voice, to be shown the ordinary face again. And he was. And there was his friend, sitting where he had been sitting all along, holding the reins. That is the whole of the song, or as much of it as belongs in a story told at night. After that, the bow was picked up, and the war itself. This telling passes over in a few sentences, and does so on purpose, and says why. It went on for 18 days. Very nearly everybody who came onto that plain died on it, including the old man who had taught them all, and the teacher, and the 100 cousins, and the sons of the 5, and it did not end in triumph for anybody. The side that won walked back off that field into a silence that the accounts describe as worse than the fighting. And of all the many, many people who have told this story over thousands of years, in every language of that country, there is not one who tells this part happily. It is told the way you would tell a thing that happened to your own family, quietly, without any relish in it at all, because it is understood by everyone who tells it that both of those armies were the same house. And so the plain at the end. Evening on the 18th day, and the light going, and a very wide, flat country, with the dark coming up out of the low ground the way it does. Birds going over, high, on their way somewhere else. Far off at one end of the plain, small in all that space, the fires of a camp being lit for the night. One, and then another, the way lamps come on in any ordinary place at that hour, in any year, anywhere in the world, when the day's work is finished, and there is nothing more that can be done about any of it until the morning. You will remember the chariot standing in the middle of the field, and the two men in it, and the two men in it, and the fires being lit at the far end of the plain, when it was all over. 36 years went by. The tellers give them almost no room, and the small amount of room they give them is the truest thing in this chapter, because it is about the ordinary business of carrying a grief for a long time. The 5 brothers took the kingdom they had asked for, and ruled it, and did it well, and were never entirely happy again. The old blind king and his queen went on living in that house for a while, and then walked away from it into the forest, as people of that age and that country did, and did not come back. And Krishna went home to the coast. He went back to the tide going in and out under the causeways twice a day, and to the gates being shut at dusk, and to a courtyard in the morning. And he lived there for a long time as an old man among his own people. And the accounts of those years are quiet and unremarkable, and give the strong impression of somebody who had done everything he had come to do. And there was a curse on his people, and it had been laid a long time before. Very slow, soft, low, and even, with unhurried pauses at the end of every sentence. Keep the energy calm and soothing throughout. Read only the provided text. Do not add or improvise any extra words. The old queen of the house that lost, the mother of the 100, who had sat in that hall on the day of the dice and had done nothing, and who had then buried every one of her sons, had said a thing to him once, when it was all finished. She was standing in a field among the dead at the end of it, She said, in effect, "You could have stopped this. You, of all of them, could have stopped this, and you did not. And so let your own people go the same way mine did, from the inside, by their own quarreling, and let there be nobody left to bury them either." The tellers do not present this as sorcery, and this telling will not either. It was a mother's word, said in the worst hour of her life, by a woman who had a right to say something. And he took it, and did not argue with it, and said that it would be as she said. And it was. It came, in the end, from nothing. That is the point of it. A generation had grown up in that city who had not been at Kurukshetra, the wide plain where the two houses met, and who had heard about it all their lives. They were proud, and they were idle, and they were the grandsons of a great many famous men. And one day, a very long way from home, at a festival on the coast, they drank, and an old argument about which of their fathers had behaved best on that plain came up between two of them. And it went from words to hands, and there was nothing at that place to fight with but the reeds growing along the shore. And men who have decided to kill each other will do it with reeds. By evening, most of the young men of that city were dead on a beach, and their fathers, who had gone down to stop it, were dead with them. The story tells this softly and briefly, and with enormous sadness, and does not linger. And it says the thing it always says about such hours, which is that they were told the ending before the beginning. An old people came to its end, at the far side of a long life, having outlived what it was for. Balarama, his elder brother, fair as the moon, strong as the plough, went and sat down at the edge of the water when he had seen it, and went out of the world there, quietly, on his own terms. And the accounts say only that he went into the sea, and that the sea took him kindly, and they leave it there. And then the sea came for the city, not as a wave, and not as a punishment. As a tide that did not go back out. The old accounts describe it almost gently, the water standing a little higher in the lower ways each season, and then the lower ways being given up, and then the wells going salt one after another, and the people leaving in boats and on the land road with what they could carry, in no great hurry, over a long time, the way people actually leave a place. And behind them the sea coming in through the many gates, and up the steps, and into the courtyards and the halls, and the fish getting into the streets, and the lamps not being lit, and the whole of that impossible city going quietly back under the green water it had been built out of. And he walked inland from all of it, alone, and came to a grove. The tellers put it in the late afternoon, and they describe it carefully, and it is the last landscape in the story, so it is worth having properly. A patch of old trees a little way back from the shore, with the light coming through them low and yellow. Long grass under them, dry, moving a little. The sound of the sea, close but not visible, doing the thing the sea does, which is the same thing over and over with small variations, endlessly. Nobody there. He lay down under one of the trees with his back against it, in the shade, and put one foot up across his knee to rest it. And the sole of that foot showed through the leaves at the edge of the grove, and it was pale. And in the low sun, through the moving grass, it looked, from a distance, exactly like the ear of a deer. And there was a hunter in that country called Jara the hunter, who did not know. He was old, and he was poor, and he was very good at his work. And he had been following something all afternoon, and had lost it. And he came along the edge of that grove at the hour when the light is worst. And he saw the small, pale movement in the grass at 40 paces. And he was hungry. And he did what he had done 10,000 times, and he shot. And then he came forward through the grass to collect what he had killed, and found an old man sitting under a tree with an arrow in his foot. The accounts say that Jara went to pieces entirely. He was on the ground. He was saying the same few things over and over, the way people do. He had understood, within a few seconds, both who this was, and that it could not be undone, and there was nothing whatever that he could offer or do, and he knew it. And the last thing that happens in this story is that he was forgiven before he could ask. That is the whole of the ending, and it is worth saying slowly. He did not have to beg for it. He was not permitted to spend even a minute in the state he was in. The old man under the tree got hold of him and told him immediately and clearly that it was all right, that it had been going to be this and it might as well be him, that he had been out doing his work in the ordinary way, at the ordinary hour, and had made an ordinary mistake, and that he was to go home now, and to stop, and to be at peace about it, because there was no debt, and there was going to be no punishment, and he was in any way at all in trouble. And then Krishna sent him away, so that he would not have to watch. The going itself is not described. Every telling declines to describe it, and they are right too. What they say is only that a light went out of that grove, the way light goes out of a room when somebody carries the lamp into the next one. The room is not destroyed, and nothing has ended, and it is simply that the light is now somewhere else, And this room is dark and quiet and perfectly all right. And afterward, they say, the earth was lighter, which brings the whole thing back to where it started, in the first hour of this story, with an earth that had grown heavy, the way a house grows heavy when the people in it have stopped being kind, and that had gone to somebody and said, in whatever way the earth says things, that she was tired. Whatever it was that she had asked for, she had it now. It had taken the whole of Krishna's life to do, and it had cost him everything he was fond of, and it had worked. So the story could end there, on a beach, with an empty city under the water, and an old woman of an earth setting down her load at last. But nobody ends it there, and neither will we. Because there is still, in the north, a long way inland, a bend in a dark, slow river, and a low green hill beside it, and a forest of tulsi and long grass, where the paths go through like partings in hair. The cattle still come down to the water at that bend in the evening, and stand in the shallows with the flies gone and their heads low, and drink for a long time, and nothing in that water has ever troubled them since. The hill is exactly where it was set down. Every autumn the moon comes up full over that grass, and the grass goes silver, and people walk out into it, and have done every year for 3,000 years, because they have heard all their lives that something happened out there once, and that some of it might still be going on. And in that forest, on any night you like, if the tellers are to be believed, there is a sound in the trees along the river that is not the water and is not the wind. It is a small sound, and it is not going anywhere, and it does not want anything from you. And it has been in that grass since long before any of the sorrow in this story ever happened, and is still there long after all of it is finished. So let the story fold itself closed there, gently, a long way from the sea, and a long way from the plain, in the only place it ever really wanted to be. The path through the forest lies empty and pale in the moonlight. The dew comes down on the seed heads without any hurry, as it has done every autumn night since long before any of this was written down. The cattle are in their pens with their heads low. The river goes past below the bank, dark and slow, and entirely unbothered, carrying the reflected moon a little way downstream, and then letting it go. Somewhere back along the water, a village is asleep, with its fires damped and its pots cooling, and nobody in it is troubled by anything at all. The forest sleeps, and the river sleeps, and the sound is still in the grass, and all is well, and all is still.